Hello, wonderful listeners of Sci-Fi stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep our team afloat. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to survive and continue bringing you these adventures. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the video description or pinned comment. Sector 9 is dark. Sector 10 is dark. Atmospheric temperatures dropping to absolute zero. The automated voice of the Orovari High Command echoed through the war room, stripped of all panic, which somehow made it infinitely worse. Billions of souls, reduced to flickering lights on a holographic map, extinguishing one by one. The eclipse was eating their worlds, and the galaxy was bleeding out in total, freezing silence. The Orovari Alliance had always defined themselves by light. For thousands of years, they built their civilization on optical energy, weaving sunlight into towering crystalline spires and harnessing the raw radiance of nebulas to power their armadas. They were the brilliant, shining crown of the Orion Spur. Now, they were just meat waiting to be frozen. "Central grid failing," a sensor technician whispered, his iridescent skin pale with terror. "Thermal reserves at 4%, 3%. They are breaching the interplanetary defense lines." The eclipse was not an army. It was not a fleet of warships. It was an abyssal, organic cloud of absolute consumption, a predatory nebula that fed on molecular motion. Wherever it touched, it drained all heat and kinetic energy, leaving behind only the absolute stillness of dead, frozen worlds. It did not negotiate. It did not conquer. It simply ate the warmth of the universe. 12 billion Orovari had already been turned into perfect, statuesque ice sculptures on the outer colonies, their final screams frozen in their throats. In a last act of suffocating desperation, the High Council aimed their most powerful communication array toward the only sector of the galaxy left untouched by the freezing dark: Earth. Humanity was a crude, volatile species, but they possessed a terrifying resilience and brutal military-industrial complexes. If anyone had the raw firepower to burn the eclipse away, it was the humans. The transmission was a literal beg for salvation, broadcasting the agonizing deaths of their people. The response from Earth took exactly 42 minutes to arrive. It was not a battle plan. It was not a negotiation of terms. It was a single, automated line of text that flickered across the main tactical display of the Orovari Command Center. "Message received. Hold your lines. We are deploying 1 star." A collective gasp of fragile hope rippled through the war room. 1 star. It had to be a code name for humanity's most devastating superweapon. A Dyson sphere-powered dreadnought, perhaps, or a fleet of world crackers capable of unleashing the fury of a supernova. Supreme Commander Valen ordered all remaining planetary shields to be diverted to the designated drop zone, sacrificing thousands of lives in the outer districts just to ensure the human weapon could make planetfall safely. They braced for the thunderous roar of antimatter engines. They watched the sky, praying for a blinding column of fire to split the suffocating black clouds of the eclipse. The sky did crack open, but there was no thunder. There was only a pathetic, high-pitched screech of failing atmospheric thrusters. Plummeting through the frozen stratosphere was a single orbital drop pod. It was not a sleek, heavily armored spearhead of human engineering. It was a cylindrical hunk of rusted iron, peeling gray paint, and dented plating that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrapyard centuries ago. It slammed into the crystalline courtyard of the High Command with a sickening, metallic crunch, skidding across the ice and taking out a decorative fountain before coming to an unceremonious halt. Commander Valen stared through the reinforced observation glass, his optical sensors twitching in disbelief. "Is that the targeting beacon?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and rising dread. "Where is the fleet? With a hiss of depressurization, the rusted door of the pod blew outward, clattering loudly against the frozen pavement. Heavy combat mechs of the Oravari Royal Guard immediately aimed their plasma cannons at the opening, waiting for the devastating human war machine to emerge. A heavy, steel-toed boot stepped out into the biting cold. It was followed by a man. He was unequivocally, disappointingly human. His name was Dwayne Brubaker. He looked to be in his late 40s, sporting a heavy shadow of graying stubble and a deeply lined face that looked like it had been carved from tired, weathered stone. He was dressed in a worn, faded brown insulated work coat with a faux fur collar, a pair of stained denim trousers, and thick work gloves. He wore no exoskeleton. He carried no plasma rifle. There was no tactical heads-up display glowing over his eyes. The only piece of technology visible on him was a crude, glowing biometric heart monitor, surgically embedded directly into the skin of his left wrist, its green line pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. In his right hand, he clutched a brass storm lantern. The glass was smudged, and the lamp was completely unlit. The man stood in the courtyard, the temperature already plummeting past -50 degrees around him, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. His eyes, dark and heavy, swept over the towering Oravari war machines and the desperate, glittering faces of the alien commanders behind the glass. They were the eyes of a man who had lived 1,000 painful lifetimes and was entirely exhausted by every single one of them. Commander Valen slammed his fists onto the tactical console, the crystal surface cracking under the force. "A human!" he roared, his voice breaking into a shriek of ultimate betrayal. "They sent us a single, unarmed primitive with an oil lamp. This is their response to our extinction, a joke." Outside, the dark, swirling mass of the eclipse began to descend upon the courtyard, drawn by the sudden, brief pulse of heat from the crashed pod. The freezing death had arrived for the High Command, and humanity had answered their dying prayer with an insult. Inside the grand strategic sanctum, chaos reigned absolute. High-ranking officers of the beautifully crystalline species hurled furious commands at deafening volumes, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of impending doom. Three-dimensional tactical projections bathed the room in a sickly blue hue, mapping out the systematic slaughter of their once invincible armies. Entire continents were turning black on the holographic globe. Into this crucible of advanced, terrified intellects, heavily armed guards shoved the human forward. Dwayne Brubaker stumbled slightly, catching his balance with a heavy scuff of his worn, steel-toed boots against the pristine glass floor. He did not look up at the floating arrays of orbital defense grids. He did not gasp at the towering, majestic architecture of the command center or the intricate battle armor of his hosts. Instead, he slowly patted down the deep pockets of his thick parka, pulled out a crushed packet of mints, and casually popped one into his mouth. "Are you completely deaf, you primitive ape?" Commander Valen screamed, marching right up to the human until they were inches apart. "Your species was supposed to send salvation. We are losing tens of thousands of soldiers by the second. What is the meaning of this farce?" Dwayne chewed his mint slowly, the sound obnoxiously loud in the tense atmosphere. He looked around the massive room, blinking tiredly against the harsh, blue, holographic light. "Do you folks have any warm water?" he asked. His voice was a low, gravelly drawl that completely ignored the hysteria surrounding him. Throat gets mighty dry on a long drop like that. Also, which way is the Eastern Front? The room fell dead silent. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. A junior tactician, trembling from head to toe, slowly pointed a slender, glowing finger toward the heavy titanium blast doors leading out to the eastern gorge. "It is -200 degrees Celsius out there," Valen hissed, his optical sensors flaring wide with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Our entire Eastern Battalion has been crystallized. If you step outside that door without a heavily shielded thermal dreadnought suit, Your blood will literally freeze solid before your lungs can even collapse. You will shatter like glass. Gotcha. East it is, Dwayne muttered, scratching his stubble. He did not ask for a weapon. He did not ask for a thermal dreadnought suit. He did not ask for a tactical briefing. He just gave a polite, awkward nod, zipped his heavy winter coat all the way up to his chin, and ambled toward the airlock with the heavy, reluctant steps of a man heading into a double shift at a factory. The Orovari generals clustered around the main surveillance feeds, their outrage momentarily eclipsed by sheer, morbid curiosity. They expected him to die the second the outer doors opened. The external high-definition cameras tracked the lone human figure as the heavy blast doors slid shut behind him, sealing him out in the absolute dead zone. The landscape was a sprawling graveyard of white and gray. The wind howled like a wounded beast, carrying the invisible, hungry mass of the enemy. The moment Dwayne stepped into the open snow, the swirling, predatory clouds of the freezing entity sensed a fresh, biological heat source. It descended upon him instantly. It was a ravenous vortex of dark energy, eager to suck the meager warmth from his frail, unarmored shell. The tactical screens in the command center flared violently red as the entity completely enveloped the man. Valen turned his head away, disgusted and unwilling to watch a pathetic, pointless suicide. But a sudden, sharp gasp from the junior tactician forced him to look back at the monitors. On the massive screen, the dark cloud was swirling furiously around Dwayne, whipping his jacket around. But the man was not turning to ice. He was not screaming. He was not even shivering. He just stood there in the dead center of the cosmic death storm, looking vaguely annoyed by the wind blowing in his face. He let out a long, heavy sigh, unzipped his coat slightly, and methodically pulled off his thick right work glove, tucking it securely under his left arm. Then, he lifted the dented brass storm lantern. He reached for the rusted knob on the side and gave it a firm, deliberate twist. There was no light bulb inside the shattered glass casing. There was no wick, no oil, no chemical battery. Instead, the exact moment the valve opened, a blinding, impossible speck of radiance bloomed into existence. It possessed a physical structure that utterly defied every foundational law of the universe the Orovari had ever studied. It was a compressed singularity of pure, blazing potential. It did not immediately radiate traditional thermal heat to melt the snow around him. Rather, it emitted an overwhelming, agonizing presence of sheer existence. The dark, hungry entity surrounding Dwayne suddenly halted its assault. For the very first time since the devastating invasion began, the freezing cloud seemed to experience something akin to an emotion. It was trembling. The illogical light from the old brass lantern pierced straight through the dark matter. The entity writhed, emitting a silent, rippling shriek of quantum dissonance. Unable to consume or comprehend this paradoxical energy, the microscopic organisms that made up the cloud began to catastrophically fracture. The air itself shattered like cheap, brittle glass. Vast swaths of the freezing entity simply broke apart, dissolving into harmless, glittering dust that rained down gently upon the snow. Dwayne did not draw a weapon. He did not charge forward with a battle cry. He just started walking. It was a slow, methodical, utterly exhausting trudge through the frozen wasteland. As he walked, he began to speak. His deep, warm voice carried clearly over the howling wind, murmuring complex thermodynamic equations as if he were reciting an old, comforting lullaby to a frightened child. The change in internal energy of a closed system is equal to the heat added to the system, minus the work done by the system, he whispered, stepping over a massive snowdrift. Entropy of an isolated system can only increase. He approached a massive trench where thousands of elite Orovari soldiers stood frozen in mid-action, their magnificent crystalline armor coated in thick layers of absolute ice. Dwayne paused and held the lantern slightly higher. The impossible, golden light washed over the endless rows of frozen statues. It was not a rapid, violent melting. It was a gentle, almost miraculous rewinding of death itself. The absolute ice clinging to the soldiers began to weep away in heavy, warm droplets. The vibrant, iridescent colors returned to their pale, lifeless skin. Inside the heavily fortified command room, the biometric scanners on the main console suddenly erupted in a cacophony of frantic, joyful beeps. Heartbeats, hundreds of them, then thousands of them. Soldiers who had been clinically dead just moments ago collapsed to their knees in the slush, coughing up shards of frost, their lungs drawing in huge, desperate breaths of thawed air. They looked up in absolute, terrified awe at the rugged, bearded human, strolling casually through the battlefield. He was just a man in a winter coat, casually reciting the fundamental laws of physics, while the deadliest force in the known galaxy shattered into dust at his worn-out boots. Dwayne just kept walking, muttering equations to himself, holding up the tiny, impossible sun against the encroaching dark. Deep within the secure archives of the command center, the chief medical officers of the Orivari Alliance stared at the incoming biometric data from the human's wrist monitor. The holographic readouts were flashing a violent, impossible crimson. They had managed to isolate the quantum signature emanating from the man, expecting to find a concealed fusion reactor or a highly advanced zero-point energy battery tucked inside his coat. What they found instead made their iridescent skin turn a translucent, sickly white. Humanity had not sent a metaphorical star. They had not sent a machine. They had taken the literal, hyper-dense core of a dying white dwarf and surgically woven it into the center of Dwayne Brubaker's chest cavity. The chief medical officer traced the glowing biological schematics with a trembling finger. The microscopic star was not contained by magnetic fields or titanium plating. It was tethered directly to the man's central nervous system. Every single synapse, every fragile human nerve ending, was acting as a biological dampener, keeping the celestial body from instantly expanding and consuming the entire sector. The eclipse was not a conventional army. It was a mindless, primordial phenomenon, a cosmological parasite that hungered solely for scalar energy. It devoured thermal radiation and kinetic motion with the insatiable appetite of a black hole. When the Orivari fired their grand optical lasers, the entity simply drank the light and grew stronger. But it had never encountered a human being. More importantly, it had never encountered what a human could do when a dying star was plugged directly into their soul. Dwayne was not fighting the cold. He was not shooting the dark clouds. He was utilizing a terrifying, newly discovered branch of quantum physics. He was weaponizing the sheer, crushing weight of human memory. As he walked through the frozen plains, the biomechanical interface in his chest demanded fuel to keep the star ignited. Dwayne provided it by remembering. He closed his eyes against the biting wind and recalled the agonizing ache of a broken heart. He remembered the smell of rain on hot asphalt during a late summer afternoon. He pulled up the sharp, visceral grief of watching his mother pass away in a sterile hospital room, and the soaring, uncontainable joy of holding his newborn daughter for the very first time. He funneled every ounce of that chaotic, messy, beautiful human experience straight into the white dwarf core. The star reacted violently, transmuting his psychological weight into a tangible, quantum wavelength. It generated emotional heat. When the predatory clouds of the eclipse rushed in to feed on this new energy source, they inhaled a frequency they could not mathematically process. It was not simple thermodynamics. It was a dense, contradictory storm of sorrow, love, regret, and hope. The quantum structure of the dark entity could not parse the complexity of a human soul. The moment the creatures absorbed the emotional radiation, their fundamental algorithms overloaded. They shrieked in silent agony, their dark matter forms fracturing instantly into millions of harmless, iridescent quartz crystals that drifted beautifully to the ground. Deep inside the jagged trenches of the Obsidian Canyon, an entire Auravari strike battalion was trapped. The temperature had plummeted to -300 degrees. Their crystalline armor was cracking. The encroaching dark mass of the eclipse swirled above them, preparing for the final, consuming strike. Then, a heavy pair of boots crunched into the snow. Dwayne slid down the icy embankment, his breath forming thick clouds of steam. He did not yell orders. He did not raise his lantern to attack. He simply walked to the center of the terrified, freezing battalion, brushed off a snow-covered boulder, and sat down with a heavy grunt. He looked up at the swirling vortex of absolute death descending upon them, offered a tired, crooked smile, and spoke in his gravelly drawl. "So, a guy walks into a bar with a piece of asphalt under his arm," Dwayne said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. He looks at the bartender and says, "I will take one beer for me, and one for the road." It was a terrible, groan-inducing joke from a distant, muddy blue planet. But as Dwayne chuckled at his own terrible humor, a profound wave of fond nostalgia washed over him. He remembered his old buddies, the smell of cheap beer, the warm glow of a neon sign on a Friday night. That simple, pure memory struck the white dwarf core like a hammer. A massive, invisible dome of warm, golden radiation erupted from his chest. It swept over the freezing Auravari soldiers, instantly thawing their armor and filling their rigid bodies with the comforting heat of a distant summer afternoon. The descending cloud of the eclipse crashed into the dome of nostalgia. The pure, unadulterated humanity in the radiation tore the dark entity apart at the molecular level, turning the deadly storm into a shower of sparkling, harmless dust. The rescued soldiers stared at the strange, bearded creature in absolute reverence. Within hours, whispers began to spread across the encrypted military channels. They called him the God of Summer. They believed he was an invincible, divine being sent by the cosmos to banish the dark. They did not know the truth. They could not see beneath the heavy winter coat. They did not know that every time Dwayne remembered, every time he forced the star to burn with his emotions, the intense gravitational pull of the white dwarf was slowly, agonizingly crushing his internal organs into ash. On the 12th day of the campaign, the grand illusion of the invincible deity finally shattered. Dwayne Brubaker did not fall in glorious battle against the dark entity. He collapsed entirely on his own, his heavy boots giving out just as he crossed the threshold of the primary medical bay. The thud of his heavy body hitting the pristine, crystalline floor sounded like a dying engine tearing itself apart. The medical personnel rushed forward, but they immediately stumbled back, crying out in sheer shock. Intense heat was radiating from the human in violent, rippling waves that warped the very air around him. Where his thick winter coat had fallen open, the Auravari doctors could see his exposed skin. It was cracking and peeling back to reveal a network of veins that were not pulsing with red blood, but with a terrifying, luminescent yellow fluid. He was literally cooking alive from the inside out. The ambient thermal scanners in the emergency room shrieked their alarms, displaying his internal body temperature climbing rapidly past 180 degrees Celsius. The chief surgeon, his translucent face pale with terror, grabbed a heavy canister of liquid nitrogen coolant. "His biology is melting," the surgeon yelled, rushing toward the fallen human. "Initiate the cryogenic suppression protocol immediately." Before the freezing mist could even touch his clothes, Dwayne's hand shot out, his fingers, charred black and blistering at the tips, wrapped around the surgeon's wrist with the crushing force of a mechanical vice. Dwayne's eyes snapped open, glowing with a terrifying, miniature solar flare. "Do not touch me with that," Dwayne roared. His voice sounded like grinding tectonic plates, a wet, agonizing rasp tearing from his scorched throat. "If you cool me down, if you freeze my nervous system, The thing in my chest will break its leash. It will expand instantly, and it will swallow your entire planet whole." The surgeon dropped the canister, stumbling backward as the sheer gravity of that statement settled over the suffocating room. They dragged him onto a reinforced surgical table, built to withstand extreme thermal stress. Commander Valen stood by the side of the bed, watching in grim silence as the human writhed in a feverish, burning delirium. The majestic, crystalline armor of the Orovari felt entirely useless in the presence of this man's raw suffering. "Why did they choose you?" Valen asked softly, stepping closer to the radiating heat, despite the warnings of his suit. "Are you a grand martyr of your world? A genetically engineered super soldier built to carry the sun?" Dwayne let out a harsh, bubbling laugh that quickly dissolved into a wretched fit of coughing. He spat a glob of glowing yellow blood onto the metal tray beside him, the fluid sizzling loudly against the steel. "A soldier," he gasped, his breath smelling of ozone and burning marrow. "Pal, I was a rock breaker. I drove a mining rig out in the Jupiter asteroid belt. 12 years of hauling dirty ice and iron." He squeezed his eyes shut as another violent wave of internal fire scorched his ribcage. "Our rig had a 0-point reactor failure. A bad one. It blew the whole station to cinders. 400 men died in less than a second. But not me. I got pinned under a heavy bulkhead, breathing toxic fumes for 6 days before the recovery team found me. The military scientists back on Earth, they looked at my medical charts. They realized I did not survive because of some divine intervention or genetic miracle. I survived because I possessed an illogical, deeply stupid level of stubbornness. I just refused to stop breathing." Dwayne reached a trembling, charred hand toward the medical tray. He completely ignored the highly advanced regenerative gels and the glowing vials of alien anesthetics. Instead, he picked up a crude, heavy-duty insulated suturing needle and a length of thick, thermal-resistant thread. So, when the brass found out they had a volatile, dying white dwarf core they needed to dispose of, Dwayne continued, his voice tight with pure agony as he drove the thick needle directly into his own torn, blistered flesh. "They figured my nervous system was too damn stubborn to burn up right away. They hollowed me out, plugged the star into my spine, and threw me at the biggest problem they could find." Valen watched in absolute horror as Dwayne methodically stitched his own chest closed, pulling the heavy thermal thread tight over skin that was radiating deadly heat. The human's face was a mask of pure, concentrated torture, yet he did not make a single sound of complaint. "Take the pain dampeners. At least," Valen pleaded, his usual arrogance entirely stripped away by the visceral display of endurance. "Your biology is failing. You do not have to suffer this deeply." "I cannot," Dwayne grunted, tying off a bloody, smoking knot with his teeth. "Painkillers numb the nerves. They numb the mind. If my feelings get dull, if my memories fade, the gravity of the star takes over. I have to feel every single second of this fire, or the core collapses." In that stifling medical bay, the terrible truth washed over Commander Valen and the surrounding officers. They had thought humanity was sending them a heroic salvation out of interstellar goodwill. But Earth had not been generous. The human leaders were utterly ruthless. They had aimed a cosmic ticking time bomb at the Orovari front lines, a weapon of indiscriminate, planetary annihilation wrapped in flesh. And the only thing standing between the Orovari and a fiery extinction was a tired, broken miner from Earth, using his own agonizing pain and sheer, unyielding willpower to keep the bomb chained down inside his own chest. Something fundamentally changed in the atmosphere on the 14th day of the siege. The relentless, swirling dark clouds that had been hunting the Orovari battalions suddenly stopped their assault. The tactical holograms in the command center flickered wildly as the entire mass of the eclipse withdrew from the surface continents. It did not retreat into the vacuum of space. Instead, the entity funneled itself directly into the grand tectonic rifts, pouring down into the very heart of the planet, like a reverse geyser of dark matter. Within 48 hours, a catastrophic planetary shift occurred. The entity converged into a single, supermassive shell of absolute zero, wrapping tightly around the planetary core. The surface reacted immediately and violently. The oceans flash froze. A permanent, unnatural ice age slammed into the world, burying the grand optical spires under miles of unbreakable glaciers. The command center itself groaned under the shifting ice, the ambient temperature in the war room plummeting so fast that frost began to form on the lips of the alien generals. Dwayne Brubaker dragged his ruined body into the war room. His skin was mottled with severe burn scars from his own internal heat, and his heavy boots left faint, glowing scorch marks on the freezing floor. He bypassed the screaming tacticians and slammed his blistered hand onto the primary console. "Open the vault," Dwayne growled, his voice a dry, rasping wheeze that sounded like sandpaper on steel. "I want full access to your deepest geological archives. Right now." Commander Valen tried to intervene, his iridescent armor coated in a thick layer of frost. "You are not in command here, human. The entity is burrowing. It is trying to freeze our world from the inside out. We need you to deploy your core radiation into the crust." Dwayne turned slowly, his eyes burning with that terrifying, miniature solar fire. "Open the damn archives, Valen, before I melt this console down to slag and take the data myself." Faced with the wrath of a walking star, the technicians scrambled to comply. Ancient, heavily encrypted data streams flooded the three-dimensional projectors. The room filled with dusty, amber holograms, replacing the tactical maps with the raw, forgotten bones of the planet. Dwayne ignored the recent battle logs, his exhausted eyes scanning the planetary thermal charts dating back hundreds of years. He cross-referenced the deep crust seismic activity with the Aurivari's glorious, celebrated history of optical energy extraction. As the data compiled, the heavy, suffocating mystery of the invasion finally unraveled. The truth painted on the glowing screens was not a story of unprovoked galactic aggression. It was a terrifying biological diagnosis. "Look at these thermal spikes," Dwayne whispered, pointing a charred finger at the holographic core readings from 2 centuries ago. "Your grand civilization, your endless, shining cities. You did not harness the ambient light of the sun. You have been bleeding your own planet dry. You dug too deep, and you siphoned the kinetic stabilizers right out of the mantle." Valen stiffened, his optical sensors narrowing defensively. "We secured our energy needs to ascend as a species. It was a calculated harvest to ensure our survival." "It was a butchery," Dwayne snapped back, the heat radiating from his chest causing the frozen air to warp and shimmer. "Your planetary core is entirely destabilized. It is running a massive, critical fever. If it continues to heat up at the rate you left it, the internal pressure will ignite a planetary supernova. It will not just destroy your world. The shock wave will wipe out your entire solar system and every neighboring colony within 10 light years." The room fell dead silent, except for the harsh, labored breathing of the human. Dwayne leaned heavily against the console, his gaze locked on the swirling dark mass surrounding the holographic core projection. "The eclipse is not a conquering army," Dwayne revealed, the sheer weight of the truth settling heavily on his tired shoulders. "It is a cosmic immune system. This planet is sick, and you people are the parasites causing the infection. The entity did not come here to maliciously slaughter you. It showed up to fight the fever. It is trying to freeze the core to prevent a system-wide detonation. It is putting your world on ice to save the rest of the galaxy." The horrifying realization struck the High Council like a physical blow. The absolute victims of the war had just been unmasked as the ultimate culprits. Earth had not sent a walking nuclear deterrent out of blind loyalty to the Aurivari Alliance. Humanity's military intelligence had read the cosmic writing on the wall. They sent Dwayne to fix the critical, catastrophic failure the Orovari had caused, knowing the arrogant alien leaders would never admit their own fatal mistakes. Panic, immediate and irrational, consumed the generals. If the human knew they were the biological cause of the galactic threat, he would no longer protect them. He would let the Ice Age consume them completely to save the surrounding sectors. "Arrest him!" Valen shouted, his voice cracking with raw desperation. "Restrain the human. Do not let him interface with the entity." 4 heavily armored royal guards lunged forward. They slammed heavy, hyper-dense crystalline shackles onto Dwayne's wrists, locking his arms together behind his back. The restraints were designed to hold rampaging combat mechs. They expected the exhausted, dying man to struggle or collapse under the immense weight of the cuffs. Dwayne did not fight back. He just stood there, looking at the terrified, brilliant Orovari leaders with profound, unbearable pity. They were so incredibly advanced, yet so fundamentally blind to the natural order of the universe. "You folks really do not get it," Dwayne murmured, shaking his head slowly. He did not flex his muscles. He did not pull against the chains. He simply let the terrible, agonizing grief of 100 dead worlds rise up in his chest. The white dwarf core inside him flared with a massive surge of raw, emotional radiation. The hyper-dense crystalline shackles glowed bright orange, then blinding white, and finally shattered into a pool of molten slag that dripped harmlessly onto the floor. Dwayne stepped right through the puddle of liquid crystal, turning his back on the command center. He had a fever to break, and he was out of time. Dwayne left the glittering halls of the command center, walking alone toward the grand tectonic elevator that descended directly into the planetary mantle. The Orovari soldiers parted for him, their weapons lowered, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. They did not try to stop him. They could not. He was a man walking to his own funeral, carrying the sun in his chest. The descent took 2 grueling hours. As the heavy elevator plunged hundreds of miles beneath the crust, the ambient temperature plummeted to a realm that defied normal physics. This was the absolute epicenter of the eclipse's convergence. Down here, in the abyssal depths of the world, the cold was so profound it felt as though time itself had crystallized and stopped moving. The air was heavy, turning into a liquid, freezing slush that threatened to crush the elevator shaft entirely. Yet, Dwayne kept breathing. His internal body temperature fought a brutal, agonizing war against the external, absolute zero. His skin was a battlefield of frostbite and severe burns. He finally reached the inner sanctum, the very heart of the planet. The planetary core was a terrifying sight. It was a massive, unstable sphere of blinding, volatile plasma, throbbing with the sickly, chaotic fever of a world on the brink of a supernova. Wrapped tightly around it, suffocating it, was the supermassive entity of the eclipse. It was a swirling, dense maw of dark matter, desperately trying to drain the critical heat before the core detonated and wiped out the entire solar system. It was not a monster. It was a tourniquet applied to a bleeding, infected wound. Dwayne stepped out onto the frozen obsidian platform. He looked at the raging fever of the planet, and he looked at the desperate, starving cold of the cosmic immune system. If he destroyed the eclipse, the planet would explode. If he did nothing, the world would remain locked in an eternal, dead ice age. There was only one impossible solution, a terrifying middle ground. He had to feed the beast until it was full. Dwayne walked to the very edge of the platform, standing right where the crushing dark matter met the violent plasma core. He unzipped his torn, charred winter coat for the final time. He reached his heavily scarred hands up to his chest, his fingers finding the thick, raised seams of his own flesh and the cold, metallic nodes of the biological locking mechanism that kept the white dwarf tethered to his spine. He did not hesitate. He did not cry out. With a sickening, heavy mechanical crunch, Dwayne violently twisted the biolock, physically ripping his own chest cavity wide open. He fully unleashed the dying star. What followed was not an explosion of fiery devastation. It was a quiet, overwhelming, and absolute release of pure cosmic grace. A blinding, impossible golden light erupted from Dwayne's exposed chest, tearing through the suffocating darkness of the cavern. He did not aim the light at the eclipse to destroy it. Instead, he forced his consciousness to expand, channeling every single drop of his life force, his profound human empathy, and the immense, crushing energy of the white dwarf directly into the dark entity. He was feeding it. He offered himself as the ultimate, inexhaustible meal. The entity, starved and desperate for scalar energy to cool the burning world, eagerly drank the light. It consumed the radiant heat of the star and the heavy, bittersweet weight of human memories. Dwayne poured his shattered soul into the void. He gave the dark matter the gentle warmth of a summer morning, the quiet peace of a completed hard day of work, and the infinite, forgiving embrace of a father's love. As the eclipse gorged itself on this pure, quantum emotional radiation, its primordial hunger was finally satiated. The swirling vortex of dark matter began to slow, its chaotic structure smoothing out as it reached total thermodynamic equilibrium with the planetary core. The fever broke. The freezing storm dissolved into a gentle, shimmering mist. A profound, musical hum resonated through the very bedrock of the world. On the surface, the devastating ice age shattered. The dark clouds vanished, revealing a clear, brilliant sky. The frozen oceans cracked and thawed in minutes. But the planet did not just return to its previous state. Nourished by the balanced, harmonized energy of the human star, the entire Aurivari world bloomed. A magnificent, sprawling ecosystem of optical flora erupted from the permafrost. Towering trees made of iridescent quartz and fields of singing crystal grass spread across the continents. The Aurivari armies, standing in the newly warmed air, dropped their plasma weapons into the melting slush, staring in surreal, weeping astonishment at the impossible beauty of their reborn home. Hours later, an elite Aurivari rescue squad descended into the core chamber. They expected to find nothing but ashes and shadows. Instead, they found a man. Dwayne was slumped against the obsidian wall, completely motionless. He was not dead, but the life he possessed now was a tragic, hollow echo. He had been entirely drained. The white dwarf core in his chest was extinguished, leaving behind an empty, scarred cavity. His skin was no longer blistered and burning. It was as pale as untouched snow. The rescue medics rushed to him, their scanners screaming in confusion. His heart was still beating, a slow, agonizingly faint rhythm, but his body registered zero thermal output. The man who had carried the summer across the stars, the man who had burned from the inside out to save a selfish world, was now the coldest living entity in the known universe. He had given away every single spark of his warmth, so that an alien race could see the sun again. Slowly, impossibly. Dwayne opened his eyes. They were no longer heavy and dark. They were a pale, empty white. He pushed the medics away with a frail, trembling hand and dragged himself to his feet. Every step he took left a faint patch of frost on the ground. He made his way back to the surface, ignoring the grand parades of celebration and the thousands of Aurivari citizens who fell to their knees in worship as he passed. He walked in absolute, chilling silence until he reached the crystalline courtyard where his journey had begun. His rusted, dented survival pod still sat in the center, a crude iron blemish in a world of perfect light. Commander Valen stood by the open door of the pod, his brilliant armor reflecting the new, vibrant sunlight. He looked at the pale, freezing human, his alien features twisted with profound guilt and absolute reverence. "Where will you go?" Valen asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Your body is ruined. You have no warmth left to sustain yourself. You gave it all to us. Dwayne placed a pale, frost-covered hand on the rusted doorframe of the pod. He did not look back at the magnificent world he had saved. He just offered a faint, tired, half-smile, his breath forming no steam in the warm air. "Going home," Dwayne replied casually, his voice stripped of its deep gravel, sounding like brittle, cracking ice. "Earth needs a winter janitor." He stepped into the cramped, dark pod, and the heavy iron door slammed shut. The thrusters ignited with a pathetic shriek, and the rusted vessel slowly lifted into the sky, leaving the Orovari to their bright, beautiful future. They would sing songs of him for 10,000 years. They would build grand monuments of crystal to honor his sacrifice. But nothing could ever truly capture the agonizing, beautiful legend of the only star that had ever warmed an entire species by willingly reducing itself to freezing ashes. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I truly appreciate your time and your presence. Where are you listening to this story from today? Please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story beautiful, haunting, or simply entertaining, I kindly ask that you consider helping us out with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. That $1 helps us pay our amazing writers and editors so they can support their families and keep creating these wonderful stories for you. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next adventure.